Those of you who follow me pretty closely might be aware that I am a really huge music fan. I have in the past said that I'm probably as into music as I am into anime, although it might be hard to back up that claim anymore since I put so much time and effort into watching anime now, and I haven't been as into music in the last year because there just haven't been a lot of releases this year that I've been all that into, and I haven't been finding a lot of old stuff to gravitate towards. And part of the reason for that involves just the fact that I have listened to so much fucking music. I've gone so far out of my way to find so many things that might interest me, and I feel like in some ways I've exhausted the well of music that will actually appeal to me. I hope I'm wrong about that, but... So over time, I've gotten questions about music here and there that are just kind of all over the place. Sometimes people ask me about a certain band, or just like if what my interest is in some genre or something, or like to recommend them some stuff. And finally, today I got a message on my anime list where someone was just straight up asking like, hey, do you have any place where you go into detail about your taste in music and like what bands you like and maybe like a list of stuff that you recommend to people? And I was like, you know, I never really have just like made a video explaining my whole history and interest in music, and maybe that would be a great launching off point for me to be able to talk about music, because it can be kind of hard for people to get get into your perspective if they don't really even have a baseline understanding of like what you listen to music for, because music is such a fucking broad medium and there's so many different styles and so many different genres. And I think for a lot of people, and this was certainly true for me when I was younger, the like sort of demarcations between genres and styles of music feel very firm. For me now, they don't feel that way. Like I listen to anything. It doesn't really make much of a difference what genre it is. It's just, do I like it or not? I don't really think of music in terms of what genre it is. I mean, in broad terms, there is like rap is obviously rap, and rock is pretty easy to identify. And, you know, there's that. But, like, most of the stuff I listen to kind of crosses genres or blends them or is just completely undefinable. So, to me, it's more about, you know, just going out, finding what I like to listen to. But the reason I'm able to do that is because over my life, I sort of developed these different sensibilities and learned about each of these genres and found sounds that spoke to me. So that's why I want to lead you through this, and maybe this can be helpful for some of you to take a similar journey, especially if you started in a similar place to me, which... maybe a lot of you didn't, but, you know, if anything I talk about sounds like it could be helpful to you, maybe it will be. And in the process of doing this, I'm going to go through my whole music collection, all of my CDs and vinyl albums, in order to... I've basically broken them down into categories of, like, when I bought them or when I started listening to these bands. And that'll help me to go through my whole thing, and I'll be able to, like, show you specific albums that, you know, were influential to my tastes growing up. So to start with, my musical taste was very much shaped by my parents, as I think is true for a lot of people. Just, you know, whatever your parents are playing on the radio is probably something you're going to hear a lot of. And my parents, neither of them were ever very big pop music people. They didn't really like the stuff that was like the top 40, the chart toppers and shit like that. So I grew up listening to a lot of rock radio. My parents both were hard rockers. That's kind of how they met and like became friends in the first place, was because, or started dating in the first place rather, is because they both were into like this rock and roll and punk atmosphere in the late 80s and early 90s, and both of them loved lots of bands from that era. Some of the earliest stuff that I remember listening to in terms of like albums was Sublime's album 40 Ounces, or the one before it might have been a self-titled, whichever one had What I Got on it, and like, you know, most of the classic singles. Like, that album I remember as a kid hearing 1,000 times. And then Green Day's Dookie I also listened to a ton as a kid, and I loved that album to death. My dad was really into both of those bands. My dad always liked the sort of optimistic, more energetic and fun kind of rock music, whereas my mom was more into like the aggressive and harder kinds of rock music. But I feel like maybe she, you know, we didn't listen to her albums as much. I know she was really into Jane's Addiction, and we didn't get into it at all as kids. Me and my brother, I mean. When I say we, I usually mean me and my brother Victor. But tons of Sublime and Green Day and lots of radio, just anything that was on the rock stations at the time. You know, I remember loving the song Black Hole Sun as a kid by Soundgarden. and just yeah, all the classic radio hits. Funnily enough, I was never that into like Nirvana, who were at their like peak at the time. My parents had Nevermind, and I'd listened to it a few times, but I didn't tend to gravitate towards the more like gravelly voiced singers, the guys who were like more, a heart-shaped box. I was not as into that. I liked the more fun and Sublime and Green Day. Like those are both really fun, upbeat bands that like in spite of being rock and punk and especially in their lyrics, they had more of a like cutting edge, vibe to them, but the vocals themselves were never very harsh or gruff. So in the late 90s and early 2000s, nu metal was becoming a big deal, and I was way into that wave. I was like, 9 or 10 years old when nu metal started becoming a thing. My cousin Boyd, who is 4 years older than me, who was very much like an edgy preteen, was super into nu metal. So my favorite band, like the first band that was like mine, like not something I learned about from my parents or anything, but a band that I just fell in love with was Linkin Park. And Hybrid Theory was my favorite album growing up. I listened to it fucking probably thousands of times. Still know all the lyrics to all the songs to this day, just from, even without listening to the album in fucking years. Because it was just, for me as a kid, I always liked sort of stuff that I could see myself in. I was very like self-centric and egotistical my whole life, still am. And, I favored stuff that I could kind of imitate. Now, if you've ever listened to Linkin Park, you might know that Chester, the lead singer, has the most high-pitched voice in the universe. But I was this little tiny 8-year-old kid, and I had like, a pretty high-pitched voice, and I could go into those falsettos and stuff. So like, I loved singing along to Linkin Park, and it was always fun to like, see if I could match the notes that Chester was doing with those super long fucking, so insecure, just go on all day like that. So yeah, I was huge into Linkin Park. And then, bands like Disturbed had their first album, Slipknot. My cousin Boyd was really big into Slipknot. And that, for me, Slipknot was a little bit harder because, they were heavier and scarier and more growly and, so it was a little bit harder for me to get into. But, some of the songs from like Volume 3 and Iowa. I remember Iowa was like, I think the first album I ever bought with my own money because I had like, gotten my report card. My parents would like give me money based on like what grades I got on my report card. So if I got an A, I got like $5 or something like that. And so I made like $15 on a report card, and I went out and bought Iowa at the CD store when I was like probably 10. I'm sure I already had Hybrid Theory because my parents would have bought it for me. But the thing is that around this time also, my parents would watch tons and tons of MTV. Like MTV was always on in the house, if not Cartoon Network. And so I would see lots of TRL and I would hear all the big pop hits. And while, for the most part, I never got really into pop music, and this was in like the boy band era and, Britney Spears coming out and stuff like that, I had friends who were into that stuff. And I had this friend named Tommy who grew up to become a dancer. And like even back then he was obsessed with dancing. He would learn all the dances in all of the like music videos that came out, like all the Britney Spears and NSYNC videos. And so I knew a lot of that music pretty well. So I kind of grew up with like, like I didn't dislike that stuff the way that my mom did. My mom hated, all the boy bands and shit, but I was okay with it. And then also around that time would have been when, and this is the first one I can pull out a CD for because most of these bands I'm talking about, it's not that I don't have the CDs, it's that they're in my mom's collection because, over time I got out of most of these bands, and so I just left them with her. But Eminem was on the radio around the time, and, I would sing along to all his songs because for me, like, I loved singing along to music where there was sort of like a challenge to it, where it's like, can I hold my breath long enough to hold this note? Can I, match the speed that Eminem's rapping at? When the song Real Slim Shady came out, and it's like this, it's a really fun and quirky song, and so little me, singing along to y'all act like you never seen a white person before. Jaws all on the floor like Pam when Tommy just burst in the door, started whooping her ass. Like, someone about the furniture, and like, you know, that stuff I would like rap to myself all the time as a kid. So like, even though I wasn't really that exposed to rap music at this age, like, because Eminem was on MTV and he was on like the pop radio and stuff, like I would hear that kind of that stuff as well. So like, um you know, I had some exposure to all these different genres in you know, from different people in my life or from TV, and on some level each one would influence me. But I was mostly into rock, and like in the year 2000 or so, whenever they came out with the song Chop Suey, my mom got really into System of a Down. Like, she became this obsessive fangirl of System of a Down for like 10 years. So they were a huge part of like my musical upbringing, you know, because I would hear them fucking constantly. She would play the CDs in the car over and over and over again everywhere we went. So like, yeah, all those new metal and all that hard rock stuff was like really what I came up on. And there was a period in like 2003, because again, I had my cousin Boyd around, and he would, like, at one point my parents got me a computer, and this was around when LimeWire was a thing, when file sharing was a dangerous thing that got viruses all over your computer constantly. 90s kids remember. And my cousin Boyd had like downloaded all this music onto my computer, like all this stuff that he wanted to listen to, most of which I had little interest in, and so I wouldn't really investigate it for the most part. But he had downloaded all this music onto my computer, and he was listening to stuff like Mindless Self-Indulgence and Him, and like, you know, the bands of '03, of the youth culture of '03, if you will, stuff that high schoolers would be listening to in 2003. But this was also when there was lots of like, there was lots of mystery to the internet at the time, because this is when bands started having their albums leaked, and it's also when mislabeling was a big deal. So like, my mom had all these like burned CDs of like downloaded System of a Down B-sides and shit, where it'd be like, which System of a Down, their third album, which is called Steal This Album, was like just like a studio masterings of a bunch of B-sides that had been leaked on the internet for a long time that people had been stealing for the last couple of years, and they just like remastered them. So most of the songs on that album I was already very familiar with before they came out, because my mom had been playing them on these mix CDs. But there'd also be all this weird shit where people would like, you know, mislabel a band as being System of a Down. A famous example is a vocal version of the Zelda theme where it's like, Link, he come to town, he come to save the Princess Zelda. And it was always labeled as a System of a Down song because it kind of sounded like Surge's vocals. It wasn't. Anyways, so I also heard a lot of different styles of music from that, because like System of a Down had done like these collabs with like the Wu-Tang Clan and shit, and there was you know, there would be different like rap rock songs and shit, and you know, stuff from what the fuck are they called? Limp Bizkit, who I did listen to back in the new metal days. Thank God I was never that into them. But like, so I would hear all these different musical styles because of LimeWire and because of these people. And this is going to be sort of a theme throughout this story, is that like a lot of how I got into so many different kinds of music is just that I was constantly exposed to like a lot of sources for it, you know? Also in that era would have been when Gorillaz' first album came out. Was huge into this as a kid. It kept growing on me more and more as the years went by, and like when Demon Days came out, that was a pretty big deal too. And 2005, I believe, is when Demon Days came out, and that's the year when I like started getting really, really into music, because up until this point, like, I would always sort of jump from one hobby to the next, like all through my life. You know, growing up, I had a period where I was into Power Rangers, then I was into The Lost World, then I was into Godzilla, then I was into Pokemon, and that lasted a long time. Then I got into anime, that lasted a couple years. Then I got into video games. But then, when I was into video games, like me and my brother Victor, we would sit around in my room and like take turns, you know, playing games and stuff. And usually he would play games and I would sit there and watch, and I'd either like read him a strategy guide, or I'd sit on my computer and like sit on forums and shit, and I'd play music like over the games, because neither of us ever really cared about game music all that much. I know for some people that's like a mortal sin, but I don't care. So it's just not, it wasn't my genre. You know, I grew up on rock. Orchestral music never meant anything to me. So we'd just mute the game and we'd play our own music over it. And, you know, most of it was the stuff that I've been describing, System of a Down, shit like that. But, like, when Demon Days came out, a friend of mine gave me, like, a burned copy of it. So I didn't actually hear... The burned copy we had only had half of the final song, Demon Days. So for, like, years, I didn't even know that it turned into, like, the gospel choir part at the end. But, like, I would listen to this burned copy of Demon Days all the time while Victor played video games. And just to cap off this sort of era, when I was big into anime, I also bought this Rurouni Kenshin Best Themes collection. It was the only anime soundtrack I bought back then, which is just like a collection of all the opening and ending themes, and then 2 cool Ani-Metal songs. Just a thing I have, not really that indicative of my musical taste at the time, so much as the fact that I got into anime. But now we're going to get into the first big era of me discovering music for myself. There were 3 bands who were absolutely integral to getting me into music in a really big way. The first one was the Mars Volta. This band came out with this album, Francis the Mute, in I believe 2005, and the song The Widow from this was on the radio, and it had a music video on TV, but it was like one of those songs that you'd only hear very rarely, and the music video would only play at like 5 o'clock in the morning while we were like, you know, because we'd be getting ready for work and stuff, and instead of watching the news, as in my parents are getting ready for work, I'm getting ready for school, instead of watching the news, we'd put on like music channels because they'd be playing really weird shit in the morning. And so my mom got really into the song The Widow by the Mars Volta, and she bought this album, and I thought the song was really cool as well. And then, like, I started listening to this thing, and this is one of, like, the most experimental and bizarre albums ever. I mean, like, growing up, I would have assumed that there was, like, a whole world of music out there that sounds just like this. That's not really the case. The Mars Volta are pretty fucking out there and distinct, especially this album. There's passages on this thing where a song will just drift into the sound of birds chirping for like 4 minutes or something. There's like these just insane sounds on this, and it's very dark and brooding and foreboding and creepy, and it's a concept album, and it's like over 80 minutes long, or like exactly 80 minutes long. It's an intense ride, and it was the first time that like music like spoke to me in such a way that I was like, holy fuck, this is like important, you know, this is something I really like want to get into. Because the more I would listen to it, the more I would discover. It just felt like a crazy mystery, you know? Especially because the track listing on here, because there's 5 songs on this album, but the last song is broken up into 8 different tracks. And if you burn this album onto your computer, it mislabels those 8 songs. And screws them up all weirdly. So, like, keeping track of where you are in the album was always, like, weird and difficult. You could never tell, like, what was going on. It was just shifting through all these phases. So every time I listened to it, it was like, what the fuck is happening? It was this experience. And so I would listen to it over and over again. And, when my family, like, the house that we had been living in at the time that this album came out, like, we moved into a new house. This was at a time where our family was in sort of financial dire straits. Now, the reason I'd been able to be into video games at the time was that I had an allowance for, you know, I'd just do some simple chores. I made like $25 a week, and I'd buy games with it. But once we moved, I couldn't afford to have an allowance anymore. And I think my PS2 broke, like, right upon moving into this house. Which was like what all my games were on. So I was pretty much fucked when it came to being into video games. And we had like the slowest, shittiest internet connection in the universe. And I would sit around on forums and like wait for them to load all day. And I would just wallow in my room. I was super depressed. This was like the period where I was like 14. I became depressed. I became suicidal. And like from here through the rest of my teens, I was a miserable fuck. But I had all this music on my computer, and so I would just sit in my room and listen to music all day, like not doing anything else, essentially. And this album, because I had so much time to just like wallow in music, and this, you know, this long, crazy album was there to keep me company, I would listen to it all the way through over and over again, you know. And I was still listening to like Linkin Park, especially Meteora at the time, because that had come out. And some other stuff, and Gorillaz Demon Days I was still really into. but like this was the first album that I got so into it that I like joined the forums for the Mars Volta, and I would like read all these analysis posts of the lyrics, because the lyrics on Mars Volta songs are like just crazy esoteric insanity. And I really think that if something got me into analysis in a big way, it was probably that. Because like growing up, I'd already been into like reviews. I would read lots of magazines, and I loved looking at review scores and like hearing, you know, what people thought of things. But like this was where I started getting into the idea that there was a deeper meaning in the thing you were consuming, and to try to figure out what that meaning was. And people would write the most like epic analyses of this album that were just totally mind-blowing. So yeah, this was a crucial part of me getting into music. So then the next band that was integral would be, let me choose the right album, would be Tool. Because this was one of the bands that my cousin Boyd had installed onto my computer. Now, in this period where I'm living in this house in like the ghetto, and we have no money, and I'm listening to music all the time, we had moved away from where my cousin was, so I wasn't seeing him anymore. But he had left all this music on my computer, and I just started exploring it. I was like, let's find out what all this stuff is, because now I'm getting really into music and I want to know about it. And he had the Tool albums Ainima and Lateralis. I don't know if either of those are how you pronounce them, but whatever. So those two albums, I was like, I discovered them, and like the Mars Volta's album, they're both these fucking 80-minute odysseys that go through all these crazy weird parts. Hold on, I'm looking for... Do I even own Ainima? I might not even own Ainima. I guess I don't own Ainima. But Ainima in particular is like fucking 17 tracks or something, and it goes through all these like weird sections and experimental pieces and like just stuff that's out there, and it's again dark and brooding and long, and you could get lost in it for a really long time. And Lateralis, which is maybe my favorite Tool album, but I discovered it a little bit later. Like those two, I would just listen to them in the same way as Mars Volta. It was this adventure. It was like this big journey I was being taken on by the music. So at this point, I started buying albums, and basically I would just buy anything that I had heard, like some radio singles, and I thought it was pretty cool, and I'd try to get into it. For instance, like the first two albums that I remember buying in this era were the Franz Ferdinand self-titled album, because they had the song Take Me Out on the radio, which was a big hit. Really loved it. And This Fire I was a big fan of. So I bought that. Pretty good album. I could still listen to it, you know, to this day. I was never that huge into it. But the one that was like a big deal was Coheed and Cambria's In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3. So a couple years prior to me buying this album, the song A Favorite House Atlantic had been on the radio, and it was a really catchy, fun song. Once again, high-pitched vocals, which the Mars Volta had this as well. All these bands have this high-pitched vocal range because, again, when I was young, I like mostly sang in like this high-pitched falsetto, like these singers, like Claudio or Cedric from the Mars Volta. So I had bought this just on like the strength of the singles, you know, and I'd also heard Welcome Home, which was like the big single from their next album, Good Apollo on Burning Star 4, but I couldn't find this album anywhere, so I bought this one instead. And I had no idea what I was getting myself in for, because I knew this band for like bubblegum pop songs, you know, like whoa, 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 in Blood Red Summer. I put this thing on, and it starts off with this fucking epic war song. Like, you can tell from the way that the song sounds. It's like a scene of a war. It's this big, huge, epic song. Talking about the song In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3. Or without the 3 on the end. The song is fucking huge. There's the chorus where he's just screaming, "Man your own jackhammer! Man your battle stations! We'll have you dead pretty soon!" And I was just like, whoa, what the fuck is happening? Again, 80 minutes long, huge epic adventure, concept album. Note that all of these are concept albums. All of these are albums where there was like some kind of story being told in the lyrics. And so like, it was not only that I was into the music itself, but that I would go and research these concepts and like really learn about the stories going on. Like in Coheed and Cambria, it's this fucking epic sci-fi narrative that spans all of their albums. This is all one giant fucking sci-fi epic, with the exception of some of their newer ones, which suck. But like Mars Volta, every album's like a different weird fucking trippy bizarro journey, and Tool is less like unified concept, but there's like a lot of meaning in their lyrics and stuff. So like all of it was the kind of music that you could really sink your teeth into, spend a lot of time with it. And as a young guy, I had a lot of time. I really had nothing going on in my life, so it was pretty easy to sit around and do that. And the reason I bring that up is just that like I couldn't do this now. There's no way I could like get nearly as into something like the Coheed narrative today as I did back then. But yeah, I later bought the Good Apollo and Burning Star 4. I still really like the first 4 Coheed albums, but this one is definitely my least favorite. I think this has a lot of like filler songs on it that aren't as interesting. But my favorite Coheed album is their first one, the Second Stage Turbine Blade. This one is just a lot more emotional, and it feels more raw and cool. Like it still has that feeling of like the progressive sounding riffs and everything, and it still has like that epic storytelling feel, but it's a lot more personal and emotional and just more consistent in general. But my second favorite is their 4th album, No World for Tomorrow, which I know probably isn't a lot of people's first or second favorite Coheed album, but this one, I love it because it's the most conceptual, it's the most, like, epic and cinematic, and, like, every song is a climax, because it's the climax of the story, and so it's just this huge, bombastic spectacle of an album with all these kick-ass, fucking massive-sounding songs. So, of course, continuing, I bought the other Mars Volta albums, The Loust and the Comatorium, one of my favorite albums, to this day. Tool's first EP, Opiate, which is pretty great. The early Tool stuff, like their first full album, Undertow, is a lot like heavier and more aggressive than their later stuff, which is like more heady and trippy. And I think it's all equally good. The Mars Volta live album Scab Dates, which when I first bought this was too much even for me at the time. Because the thing about these bands is that, like, even though I liked them for taking me on these big, epic journeys, my favorite songs were always the fun, cool, energetic rock songs. Like, on Francis the Mute, my favorite track was Elvia, because that was the one with the big, huge guitar solos and the rock, performance, because that's what I grew up on. I was still very much into heavy rock music. So, like, when things got really out there, like on Scab Dates here, which is just like a mindfuck of an album, I couldn't quite go that far. Here I've just got the rest of the Mars Volta's discography. I just grouped this by band. So Bedlam and Goliath, which is okay. Their album Nocturnicate, which I don't really care for, and Amputecture, which when this first came out, it was sort of maligned because it was like, it's less consistent than their previous 2 albums. This one definitely has some songs that are just like head scratchers that aren't that great, but I think the main tracks on here are like the best Mars Volta songs ever. Tetragrammaton is probably my favorite song by the band to ever come out. And then also in this pile, because, like, while Tool was the band I got the most into from the stuff that Boyd had left on my computer, there was other stuff that I listened to a lot, like America Must Be Destroyed by Gwar, which is a very fun, like, comedy metal album. If you don't know about Gwar, I recommend, if you like schlock and horror and like B-movie shit, well, if you like all that, you probably heard of Gwar anyways, but you should go down a Gwar hole if you like that kind of stuff, like comedy horror kind of shit. Gwar are the masters of it, and they're local to my area, so always cool to talk about Gwar. So anyway, yeah, for this period of time, I mean, there was other bands that I got into. I got into Rush in a big way because my dad had been a big Rush fan, so I listened to a lot of like 2112 and Hemispheres. And I just generally I was getting into like prog, because what I realized when I was researching all these bands is that they're all basically what is considered like light prog or neo prog bands, where they're bands that have elements of progressive rock, which is a genre from the 70s that was very experimental and out there, but they combine them with more pop and rock sensibilities and are more accessible, which is how these bands all got onto the radio. So like, at this point I'm sort of listening to stuff that dabbles in experimentation, but it still has a pop sensibility. Very boogie pop, if you will, for those of you who know my made-up terminology and shit. Not that I made up that term, but so those bands were getting me deeper and deeper into music, and I would buy CDs like all the time, but it was really hit or miss, because I would buy them on the strength of like one single or YouTube. I discovered YouTube in early 2006, and I'd search a band and try to find some of their songs. And so my rule was, if I found 3 songs that I liked from an album, I would buy the album. Not every album I bought followed that rule, but that was like the general gist of it. Is like, if I hear enough of it that I like, I'm gonna buy it. So at this point I start looking into more and more music, and I was a part of a lot of forums back then. One was a board called Otaku Boards, and there was this guy on Otaku Boards called Jake Hammerin, who was a huge metalhead, and this guy would always be in the music threads, and he'd always be talking about metal and like really singing his praises of his favorite metal bands and shit. And he convinced me to check out a lot of different stuff. I mean, this guy was also like a totally pretentious asshole who would like constantly, be mad at you if you called anything metal that he didn't consider metal and stuff like that. But I will say that that guy is also the one-man band Gallow Braid, which is a band that only ever released like 2 or 3 songs, and they are really good. If you are a fan of Agalach, check out Gallow Braid. I mean, they're basically only known by people who've like seen the songs pop up on 4chan every once in a blue moon in some kind of discussion of like atmospheric black metal or something. But the guy was a huge Agalach fan, and like basically just copied them and did a really good job. So check that out if you like that band. So at this point, 2 threads sort of came together. On the one hand, there was me on the internet finding out about music and getting into different bands that sort of related to the ones that I was already a fan of. And then there was also this meetup I had with my cousin, the same cousin Boyd. Like, we met for the first time in like a couple of years. It was just for one day. He was wearing a Sun t-shirt, the band Sun. Those of you who know them will know that my cousin has clearly gone off the deep end, because he was like a huge stoner at the time and a big music guy, and he was listening to like all this really out there shit, lots of drone, lots of like just out there experimental shit. He would listen to like free jazz and stuff, like anything that he could take drugs and listen to some trippy fucking music, he would get into that stuff. And while I was in the car with him, he was playing this album from a band called Pelican, and they are a like sort of somewhere between like a prog metal and post metal type of sound. They're considered like post rock at the time. And I was listening to it and I was like, this seems really cool. And he was like telling me about post rock and post metal. So I start looking into post rock, and that's when I find out he was telling me like one of his favorite bands was ISIS, which, their name has become very unfortunate these days, thanks to some fucking assholes who don't like to stop killing people. But anyways, because of him being really into ISIS and telling me about it, I found out about this other band that has some of the members from ISIS called Red Sparrows. And Red Sparrows was a sort of similar style of music to ISIS, but ISIS is very like shouty and dark and like grim sounding in a way. Whereas Red Sparrows was more uplifting and light, and so I kind of gravitated towards that. And then once I'd listened to them for a little bit, and I can't find either of their albums. I had their first 2 albums, but I don't know where they are. And after listening to them for a bit, I finally started listening to ISIS themselves, starting with the album Oceanic. And this is still one of my favorite albums to this day, probably in my like top 10 or top 15. I mean, I've actually loved it more and more as the years have gone on. But the best way to describe it is that it sounds like drowning in the ocean. Like, the album is a concept album about like a man who has like a troubled relationship or something and just goes to drown himself in the ocean. And the whole thing just feels like you're underwater. And it's simultaneously very pretty and also very crushing. And it sort of goes, you know, between those two emotions. It has long passages that are just like ethereal and calming, and then other parts that are crunching and terrifying. But it also has like the best sound of any album I've ever heard. Like just the way that the drums sound on this thing, the way the guitars are tuned, it's probably like my favorite sounding metal album of all time. So really solid release. Isis also had Panopticon, their next album, which is also really good. I also should just mention that around this time, I don't know how or why, but I found out about Tenacious D, who is the comedy rock and folk band that everyone knows probably. Like if you're into comedy rock music, huge influence on modern bands like Ninja Sex Party. I mean, any like comedy rock band probably owes a little bit to Tenacious D. Jack Black and Kyle Gass, there was a movie based on this. I loved the movie at the time because I was a huge fan of the band. Was not very critically well received, but yeah, cool album, very much a classic. So that guy on that forum, Jay Cameron, he was always talking up Agalloch, and he got me to start listening to them because around this time, it was actually like surprisingly easy to find a lot of like obscure music on YouTube because people would make AMVs of it. And that was like the best way to find music. Like these days, if you search the name of a song, you're gonna find like, you know, an upload that has the album cover on it and all that. But like back then, music videos and just song uploads would get deleted all the time. But for whatever reason, AMVs had a tendency not to get taken down for copyright, which is ironic because now they'd probably get, you know, anime is more taken down than music is these days. But yeah, like you could find a lot of stuff through AMV. So I remember specifically finding an AMV of the song. God, where the fuck is The Mantle? I can't find my copy of The Mantle, which is the second Agalloch album, and it was the first one I listened to. But the song A Desolation Song, set to the anime Serial Experiments Lain, which at the time I had like newly gotten into, and like that song and video combination like got me interested in the band. And like both Agalloch and the next band I'm going to talk about, Opeth, which were the two bands that this guy was way into, both of them are known for the fact that they're metal bands who have these like 10-minute songs where they go back and forth between like growled vocals and like heavy instrumentation and softer passages with really pretty and you know, like sweet instrumentation and stuff. Well, not sweet, but I mean, it's still dark, but you know what I mean. It's not heavy. So like, I would get into these bands through their more calm songs, and then, like, as I was acclimating myself to their sound and, like, really starting to like them, I would be able to handle the heavier parts and the screaming. So, like, with Agalloch, it was really, like, their calmer stuff that I first gravitated towards, and then eventually I ended up buying all their albums. Pale Folklore and Ashes Against the Grain, which was new at the time, is probably my favorite. 4 years later, they came out with Marrow of the Spirit. All of these are classic. All four of Agalloch's first four albums are absolutely must listen. Still among my favorites, even though I don't listen to metal nearly as much anymore. So then there was Opeth, and this is a box set of 3 of their albums. But like, the thing about Opeth is that at the time, this was right around when Ghost Reveries came out, which is like their fucking 7th album, I think, 7th or 8th. They have a lot of albums. And when I first discovered them, it was through they have certain songs that are calmer. They had this album called Damnation, which is all like softer prog songs. Like none of them are heavy at all. There's no growls. There's none of that. And I really loved that album. I would listen to it all the time. And then like I sort of branched into their heavier stuff and was like terrified, because I remember the first time I found out that they had like a heavier side was the song Dirge for November. Someone had made an AMV of it with Neon Genesis Evangelion, and the first like 4 minutes of that song are this like really quiet, calm, serene, sad song, and then all of a sudden, like after 4 minutes, just these incredibly dark and sorrowful, heavy fucking guitars kick in, and like the most guttural growl. It's like, "Words are the words, oh father." And I was like, ah, it was fucking scary. to me at the time. But then, like, eventually I listened to Ghost Reveries, and I thought it was really awesome. The first song on here, Ghost of Perdition, was just like, it's 10 minutes of just mind-blowingly fucking badass music, and that really got me into the band in a big way. Eventually I would listen to all their albums. I love Watershed as well. I don't think I own a copy of it, but haven't liked anything after Watershed, but everything up through Watershed was pretty good. I mean, if you asked me to go on an Opeth tangent, that would be a whole other tangent of what songs I like and what albums I like. But I would listen to this and play World of Warcraft, because Victor had gotten into that at the time. I think the first expansion had just come out. And I would play WoW and listen to Agalach and Opeth. And then I also was into Mastodon, because Blood Mountain had just come out. I'd heard, like, the song... which one was it? The song... Colony of Birchmen had played on TV a few times, and this was another band that, like, I looked up their music on YouTube, I really loved it, bought the album, and this one, Mastodon has always been, like, a great unifying band for my family, because, like, my brother Victor is a huge Mastodon fan. They're, like, his favorite band. My mom loves listening to them. Everyone loves it. So, like, we would play this in the car a lot because, you know, it was music everyone could get into. Weirdly, it was kind of weird that I liked this band so much, because they are a lot heavier, and they do have much more of the growled vocals and, like, the gruff kind of singing style, but they're just so much fucking fun. Like, Mastodon is the most fun band ever. They are just delightful to listen to. So, like, that's pretty much why we all got so into it. And then also from this era, one time my mom had just brought home, like, this mix CD that a friend gave her of the album Bloody Kisses by Typo Negative. I thought I had it, but I realized I don't actually own the CD. And I thought it was really fucking cool, and we listened to that all the time, which is like this like sort of dark gothy rock music from the early 90s that is just really kind of odd and eccentric. Like, it's not that it's super experimental so much as that no other band would write the variety of songs that they did and put them all on the same album. You'd have songs that go from, like, these long, gothic, tortured passages about suicide to, like, a goofy, bubbly song or a cover of fucking Summer Girl, you know, like, all in the same album. A lot of fun shit there. I would buy their Life is Killing Me and Origin of the Feces, neither one of which is nearly as good as Bloody Kisses, so that always kind of felt like a wasted money on those. Here's The Damn Mantle by Agalach. So, okay, at this point, it's pretty clear, like, what my tastes are, like, where I'm headed. Like, my 6 favorite bands, the first 3 are all, like, modern prog bands. The second 3 are all bands that incorporate, like, progressive elements and post-rock elements into heavy metal music. So at this point, progressive and metal was, like, my biggest genres of choice, and post-rock to some extent, but, like, I was really getting into prog and metal, and so a lot of my purchases would reflect that going forward. I found out about the band Ayreon because the lead singer of Opeth, Michael Achterfeldt, was a vocalist on this album. Ayreon is a prog band that does, like, prog operas, where each album will have, like, 12 different singers from different prog bands playing characters and, you know, enacting a narrative. Absolutely loved this album when I was younger, and I found out about that because of Achterfeldt's involvement. Was never as into the other Ayreon albums. I did buy, what was this one called? Universal Migrator, Part 1 and 2. I did buy it, and I did enjoy, like, some of the songs, but I never got into the full album, never got into any of their other albums. It's really just The Human Equation that I was, like, super into. Now, the main character on The Human Equation is played by the vocalist of Dream Theater, so I found out about them. This is the only Dream Theater album I ever got into. I don't really care for it anymore. I hate the band. They are the most pretentious assholes on planet Earth. They're a bunch of douchebags. But I liked this album because it's a lot heavier than their other ones. It's, like, sort of their most metal and aggressive and in-your-face and direct album. Whereas a lot of their stuff is just, like, straight up wanking through, like, 80 fucking time signatures or whatever. All their shit sounds the same. I hate Dream Theater, but I did like them for a time for that album. It's an okay album. Here's the 2 Red Sparrows albums. I guess I put them in the wrong section, not surprisingly, but I was into those around the time of ISIS. Now, you see, one good way of getting into new bands, and something I did a lot of back at the time, was just to look into anything that was related to them. Like, obviously with Red Sparrows and ISIS, I found out about them because I just found out that the members were in the other bands. And, Wikipedia was around at the time, so I was doing a lot of that. At the Drive-In was the previous band of the members of the Mars Volta. I could never find any of their full albums or songs, so I just bought this compilation album, The Station Is Not Operational. Liked a lot of the songs, but not enough to ever buy more of their albums. Though now, the album Relationship of Command is definitely one of my favorites. I still don't own a physical copy of it, but really love that album. But only got into it much later. And since I was way into metal music around this time, I was being introduced to more and more metal bands, stuff like Blind Guardian, who are an epic power metal band. This is the only album of theirs that I really care for, and even then, I don't love every song on here, but it does have some of my favorite songs of all time, particularly the final track, or second to last track, And Then There Was Silence, which is a 14-minute epic retelling of the Epic of Troy. Now, with this album, I feel like this is a good way to talk about, what I think defined all these albums I like. Because, yeah, sure, all of these come from, the same kind of genres, but they might seem, if you're, a fan of those genres, these might seem kind of random. Why these bands and not other ones in the genre? Why didn't I get into more stuff related to these? And it's because, and I didn't recognize this until much later in life, that I just really love dense music. I love music that has lots of shit going on. I love it when songs change dramatically over the course of the song. I was always really into the, 7 to 15 minute tracks that have multiple parts, where there's this sort of narrative going through the song, where there's lots of stuff happening in the background, where every time you listen to it, you discover something new. And Blind Guardian on this album seemed to be aiming to make the most dense sound possible. Now, I will say, the production on this album is fucking garbage, and I would not have been able to recognize that as a young guy. Now I listen to it and I'm just like, what were you guys thinking? Because what they tried to do was to create an army of musicians, and they did this by just multi-tracking the living fuck out of all the instruments and vocals. So the whole thing sounds like this giant choir is singing all the lyrics. But it's just so bombastic and over the top that I can't help but love it. And yeah, so this is kind of totally encompasses what kind of sound I was looking for. Stuff that was Wagnerian, if you will, in length and scope and attention to detail. So alright, another way that I started finding bands was through a thing called Pandora, which I believe is still around and in use by most people. In fact, it got a lot bigger over time. But Pandora was an internet radio service where you'd basically type in the name of a band, and it would give you a radio station that would play that band's songs as well as other stuff that sounds kind of like them. Now, because I'm incredibly picky, I did not get a lot of stuff that I ended up loving out of listening to Pandora over the years. And I also think it was a totally finicky system that didn't always give you stuff that made any fucking sense. But there were certain bands that I got into because they showed up on Pandora, and I believe these are a few of them that I got from the Tool Pandora radio station, which Tool is a hard band to draw comparisons to. This band is nothing like Tool, but they were on Tool's radio. Pearls and Brass. This was a blues rock band that was just all about tight, crazy riffs. This album has the coolest fucking riffs of any album ever, in my opinion. Every fucking riff on the entire album is memorable. Every song is just a string of crazy, tight guitar riffs that are all fucking badass. Band never went anywhere, never got very popular. This was their last album out of 2, but it's really good, and I've always been a fan. And then a band I got even more into as a result of Tool Radio, who again doesn't sound much like Tool, was Dredge. Their first album, Leitmotif, which is a experimental, grungy rock album. Maybe it's a little bit like Tool, but different enough. I would actually put them closer to Coheed or something. But anyways, really fun. Not like Coheed. What am I talking about? I don't know what to compare this to. It's a fun experimental album. I really loved it. It was one of my favorite albums for a very long time. I also liked their second album, El Cielo, though not as much. And then I kind of liked their third album, Catch Without Arms, but also not as much. Didn't care for their fourth one. Their fifth one, Chuckles and Mr. Squeezy, went in a totally different direction. I think it was hit or miss. It wasn't terrible. A lot of their fans didn't like it, though. And then the next big expansion on things was that, like, this happened around the same time, was that my cousin and I started hanging out again. And at this point, my cousin Boyd had reached the level where he had a car, or a truck, that was just filled, like, stuffed with burned CDs. Like, he would download every fucking album he could find, and he would burn it onto a CD and put it in these little, like, shitty, thin CD cases. And then, like, the backs of the seat in his car, where there's, like, the little sleeve on the back of a seat, were just stuffed, crammed, full of these CD cases. And so he would just, you know, listen to all this shit in his car. And so at some point, I, who industriously wanted to learn about all the new music I could find, just took all of those and burned all of them onto my computer. So a lot of it was stuff I wasn't that into. A lot of it was stuff that, like, I would have some curiosity for over the years, would listen to little bits and pieces of, you know. Some of them became some of my favorite albums. Probably my outright favorite from the whole bunch was Imaginary Sonicscape by the band Psy. This is an incredibly fucking bizarre Japanese band that is, like, they were originally a black metal band, but they just started experimenting more and more until they became an unrecognizable fucking bizarre carnival music band. They're considered avant-garde, post-avant-garde black metal is what they were described as on the Metal Archives website, which is fucking hilarious. But this is still one of my favorite bands just for being like nothing else and just sounding cool as fuck. They have the most interesting ideas. I will say that they're very inconsistent across their albums. Like, this one is great. This one is phenomenal, Insomnophobia from a few years back, but their latest album kind of sucked, and some of the albums in between these weren't that great. I do like Gallows Gallery a lot, but I don't own it. Yeah, these two and Gallows Gallery are my favorites, but, like, Psy is a pretty cool band. You should check them out. And then also around this time, Jay Cameron wasn't the only person on those forums who was, talking about interesting music. There was this other dude who was, like, really into screamo and, like, experimental, hardcore music. Now, for me, growing up, I had always been, totally afraid of and, like, averse to emo and screamo and anything that had, like, whinier vocals. Because in, like, 2004, when the whole emo rock boom happened, which, if you talk to people who actually care about, like, emo and screamo music, they'll tell you that none of this actually qualifies as emo. It's all just basically pop rock that had whiny vocals. But that was a huge scene in, like, 2004 with bands like My Chemical Romance and New Found Glory and Yellow Card and all that shit. And AFI, though I did kind of like AFI. But, like, all those bands sort of got categorized as the same thing, and my mom utterly despised that style of music. Like, she was like, you know, don't you dare play that shit in front of me kind of thing, you know? So even though I kind of, like, there were songs I liked by, like, Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco, like, I never bought their albums just because I was kind of afraid of the ridicule I'd get from my mom if I listened to that kind of stuff. But so a lot of this, like, hardcore and screamo music, like, the vocals were reminiscent of that, but the style of music was totally different. You know, these are bands that had the high-pitched screams and the wailing vocals, but it was over this really interesting music. So, this guy on that website, like, you know, would introduce me to some of those bands, and one of them was The Sound of Animals Fighting, who had put out this re-release of their first album, The Tiger and the Duke. It's again, very interesting experimental band. This was one where, like, I first listened to them on, like, MySpace. Because at the time, MySpace... Alright, let me describe what it was like to get into a band in this era. Most bands had a MySpace page, and their MySpace page usually had 3 of their songs on it. Like, so there were 3 songs you could listen to on their page and get a sense of the band. And then some of them also had a Pure Volume account, which is a website that probably no one remembers. I have, like, 10 albums that I made on Pure Volume before Bandcamp came out and made it totally irrelevant. But a lot of bands had a Pure Volume, which would have, like, 3 of their songs on it. And then there were bands that you could find some of their stuff on YouTube, you know, depending on how obscure they were or, like, who cares about them. So, like, you know, I would find these bands like MySpace and Pure Volume and like try to listen to as much of their music as I could. And like because I couldn't afford to buy my own music all the time, I was in high school, I didn't have much money. Um, you know, I would listen to some of these bands on MySpace like over and over, like listen to those 3 songs forever until I finally, you know, worked up the money and courage to put down on an album. So, you know, that's kind of how I got into the sound of animals fighting. A couple years later, in 2008, they put out one of my favorite albums to this day, which is The Ocean and the Sun. Very highly recommended experimental album. This was a band who got less and less hardcore, less and less of the screaming and the heavy rock instrumentation as they went on, and became more and more about like this sort of art rock goopy sound. That's the best way I can put it. I accidentally skipped over around the time when like the Mastodon album and everything that I also was into City of Evil by Avenged Sevenfold. Never liked any of their other albums. This one doesn't hold up that well, but it has some okay songs on it. So at the same time that I was getting into the sound of animals fighting, that guy also introduced me to the band Circle Takes the Square. And this was one that was like really, really difficult to get into because they had the most like this is the vocals. It's like, pour as fuck on the street corner, cover, study of a face and a figure. And even I'm making it sound more like black metal than it really is. It's more like screechy and stuff, and like just hearing it, it was so hard to get past the vocals at first, which is ironic because once I did, I actually realized that this album has some of my favorite vocal performances on it ever, because just the lyrics on this thing are phenomenal. It's got some of my favorite lyrics in any songs, and the way that the vocals complement the lyrics is extremely strong, and it's got all these cool little vocal moments that are highly memorable, really great lines. So getting into this album was kind of like the moment where there was no longer rock music I couldn't listen to. You know, like, at this point, I'd already gotten into, like, growled vocals. You know, I'd gotten past the hump of, like, extreme metal and, like, really heavy stuff. I was able to handle that now because of Opeth and Agalach. I'd gotten over the hump of hardcore and, like, more high-pitched vocals because of stuff like this, more experimental stuff. So at this point, if it was a rock music genre of any kind, especially metal, then I could probably handle it. And this album was sort of the breaking point, and I still adore this album. It was one of my favorites for a very long time. It's called As the Roots Undo by Circle Takes the Square. All along the way, there's still some albums that I just have around because my mom bought them. Rise Against, The Sufferer, and The Witness. They had some decent singles on this thing. Queens of the Stone Age, Era Vulgaris. I think I'd gotten this because people were just talking it up as like the album of the year. And it was good. It's got some great songs on it. That same guy who got me into Circle Takes the Square and the Sound of Animals Fighting also introduced me to Portugal the Man, who was a lot easier for me to get into because they were less hardcore, less screamy, and more of just like a... they kind of came from that background, but like their first album was just like an experimental rock album. And their first few albums were very much these like weird little experimental things where like each song would be like 2 minutes long, usually have some like really massive change in the middle of the song. All their albums were kind of hit or miss. They would have like half the songs would be really great, half of them would be just kind of okay, but I listened to their first album countless times. I still don't actually own a physical copy of it. I did buy their EP, It's Difficult Being a Wizard, which is pretty cool. It's like it's one 20-minute song that's just like a fun experimental thing. Really, I got more into them later when they changed their sound up and became like a folk rock / like a like classic classic rock and roll band who takes a lot of influence from the Beatles. They put out The Satanic Satanist, which one time I forced all of my friends, like everyone I knew, to put together a list of their top 100 favorite albums. And the one that was most consistently in everyone's top 10 was The Satanic Satanist. This was the most agreeable album against me and all of my friends. Like, this is the only one that we could put in. Everyone would be into it because it's experimental enough to be good for, you know, people who want something a little weird, but it's also catchy and straightforward enough that like anyone could appreciate it. And it's not, you know, too far in any one direction. It's just a really solid, fun album with lots of fucking great, memorable tracks on it. And but the one I like even more than this is their next album, In the Mountain, in the Cloud. Actually, it's not their next album, but a later album, In the Mountain, in the Cloud. This is my favorite of the band, and also one of my favorite albums of all time, especially for the first like 4 tracks or no, the first 3 tracks are all fucking absolutely amazing, and the final track, Sleep Forever, which is soul crushing. So at this point, I'm way into music. I'm listening to music all the time. I'm always discovering new bands. I spend a lot of time just researching bands. Some stuff I get into because I hear about it supposedly being great. You know, Primordial's album, To the Nameless Dead, which is just like, a lot of people considered it metal album of the year, so I checked it out. I liked it. Track 2, Gallows Hymn, is one of my favorite songs. Otherwise, I don't consider it that memorable, honestly. Big metal albums that people were talking about at the time, Twilight of the Thunder God by Amon Amarth had just come out. This is not their best album. I would say With Odin on Their Side is my favorite of theirs, which I think Victor owns, and that's why it's not in my collection. Around this era, the guitarist from the Mars Volta, Omar Rodriguez Lopez, started making solo albums. The first one, I know I own it, but it doesn't seem to be in my collection anywhere. Maybe it's just gone somewhere else, but it's called Emmanuel Dexterity. And it was just really odd, and like I had bought it, and it was so out there that it was one of those that was like a little bit too much for me to handle. And I never actually bought this one. This was Boyd's copy of Se Dice Bisonte no Buffalo, which I do like a lot. And I named one of my internet handles after this. Se Dice Bisonte is my manga handle, because I made a manga blog that I wanted to disassociate from my main identity for no reason, and I named myself Se Dice Bisonte. So if you've heard that story where I talked about how the first chapter of Excel World, the manga, how like I was the proofreader on that chapter, like if you find it on any manga reader site, and if you look in the credits, it says like proofreader Se Dice Bisonte. That was me, just using a different name. Because I was into post-rock, Mogwai was very critically acclaimed. I checked out Mr. Beast, which had just come out at the time. I think it was like the single off this album I really, really loved. And then the rest of it I was never as into. One of the artists who was on my cousin's, like all the music that he downloaded onto my computer was Mark Lanigan, who is a like folk, sort of country folk guy who had formerly been a member of Queens of the Stone Age, who just writes these really sad, pretty, depressing songs. And I really love him as a songwriter. He had the albums like Field Songs and I'll Take Care of You, and his collaborations with the artist Isabel Campbell. All the albums they did together are phenomenal. I really love his music, but it is unbelievably depressing. And for some reason, when I listen to him, it just like shuts me down and I can't even think anymore. So I kind of stopped listening to him a few years ago. I did pick up like his more recent stuff, like his album Blues Funeral, which is pretty good. I do still listen to this one. It's not nearly as depressing. It's a little bit more rock and industrial and pop influence, as opposed to being just a folk album. His album Bubblegum is probably one of the most accessible ones, so I'd recommend checking that out. But yeah, Mark Lanigan, great artist, one of my favorite artists, but I barely listen to him anymore because it just makes me feel like shit. Because of the anime series Gunslinger Girl, I got really into the Delgados, who did the opening theme of the show, The Light Before We Land, which is the first track on this album, Hate. This is one of my favorite albums of all time. It's just this, like, sort of epic pop music. Like, it's all very sad, and it's definitely pop, but at the same time, there's, like, a lot of orchestral instrumentation, and every song sort of has this big, swelling feel to it. Although, actually, probably my favorite track on here is the most down-tempo and calm one, Child Killers. That's a fucking sad song. But yeah, really phenomenal album. I like some of their other stuff as well, but that one's my favorite. That Jay Cameron dude who got me into Agalach and Opeth was also really heavily advocating for this band, Ensiferum at the time, who had just put out their second album. This was their first one. This album's fucking amazing. If you're into heavy metal music, especially like more upbeat stuff like power metal, or like this is like, it's not quite power metal, but it feels like that. It's very video game influenced, and like all the lyrics are about like epic quests and adventures and shit. And it's fucking awesome. It kicks a lot of ass. It's energetic and fun and cool. I think a lot of power metal kind of dips into being like cheesy. This doesn't. This like avoids the cheese factor that a lot of power metal falls into. Maybe with the exception of "Hero in a Dream," which is like the first track, which is a little cheesy, but and some of the power ballads on here are corny. But like for the most part, it's just a really kick-ass fun album. I should also mention around this time I was into Dragon Force, which was Victor's favorite band at the time. I got out of them big time later on. After seeing them live, and they put on one of the worst live performance. No, the worst live performance I've ever seen. By far. But anyway, Ensiferum was really kick-ass. Unfortunately, their first album was amazing. Their second album was pretty good, and then they had a lineup change, and everything they've released since then has sucked. Another band from the same guy who got me into Sound of Animals Fighting and all that stuff, The Fall of Troy. This album, Doppelganger, is just this like blisteringly intense, manic, crazy, edgy as fuck album where like it's all about like just crazy fun guitars and like breakdowns and like it's very much got like this hardcore sound, but while being all over the place with its guitars and shit. I don't even really know what to compare it to. It's like almost proggy in a way, but while just being like loud and abrasive and again edgy as shit. But I still really like this album. It's got a lot of cool ideas. And then another one of my favorite albums that I discovered at the time, this one was through Shabooty Radio. So Coheed and Cambria, who I talked about before they became Coheed and Cambria, they were Shabooty. And I actually, the Shabooty Penelope EP is, I might like it more than any of Coheed's actual albums. It was only 5 tracks, but they're all fucking killer. It's just 5 amazing songs, like almost all of which I consider among my favorite songs. And I just wish that they had made more as Shabooty, because that sound is so fantastic. But through looking up Shabooty Radio on like Last.fm or something, which is another internet radio site, I found out about Foxy Shazam. They don't sound anything like Shabooty. But this album, Introducing, is like, I like to call it Elvis core, because this is a band that takes like the style of like 50s swing and like 80s pop and stuff, and they combine it with hardcore and with like just intense crazy breakdowns and stuff, and they'll go from singing to screaming. Every song on here is like a totally different style. They're all really fun, really fun songs that you could dance to and scream to and fucking lose your mind to. But fantastic album. Their first album's pretty great. That one's a lot more heavy. Their third album's pretty great. That one's just like straight up 80s pop style. Like it still has some of that manic rock edge, but it's a lot less heavy than this, and a lot less like all over the place. But that's their self-titled, their third one. All the first 3 albums are really great. The ones after that are so-so. So alright, by this point, I'm a crazy music aficionado. I will go, the way I would look into bands, I would do stuff like, I'd go to Metal Archives, and I'd look up the band Psy, right? And it says they're avant-garde metal. So I'd click avant-garde, and I'd go down that tag, and I'd just listen to everything listed as avant-garde metal. And I'd find some stuff I thought was okay, like Unexpect, or some stuff that I thought was pretty great, like Subterranean Masquerade. But that's how I would find music. I'd like go out of my way to seek music. I'd go to forums, and anything people were talking about that they thought was great, that was like in the realm of music I liked, I would check it out. Now, mind you, up until this point, we still are pretty much just looking at like weird alt-prog, like alternative rock and metal music. So like that was really my whole bag, was like heavy rock, heavy metal, and anything weird and experimental and out there. But around this time I was mostly into anime. Like around 2007, I mean, when all this was happening, I was like, I would listen to music all the time because I'm still in high school. I have tons of free time. I'm just always listening to stuff when I'm not watching anime, but I'm also really big into anime. Bought a few anime soundtracks when Geneon went out of business because they had this huge blowout sale where all their albums were $5. Arjuna soundtrack, which is one of the best anime soundtracks of all time, made by Yoko Kanno, who you probably know for Cowboy Bebop and Wolf's Rain and Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex. I like this as much as any of her others. The Fooly Cooly OST, been a huge Fooly Cooly fan since the show first aired on fucking Adult Swim, and you can't watch the show and not fall in love with the pillows. This album's fucking amazing. It's the one with all the pillow songs on it. Otsuki Kenji to Zetsubo Shoujo Tachi, the Kakurenbo album. This is the Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei girls and the guy who sings the opening themes did a whole album of crazy ass weird songs. I've talked about this somewhere before, but it's really unlike anything else out there. It's a very fascinating album, very cool. And one of the Utena OSTs. This is the one where they took all the fight music and all the crazy choral rock songs that J.A. Caesar wrote for the show and remastered them to be like more listenable, and it's really cool. So over the years, my interest in music has kind of peaked in that era of all the metal stuff, you know. I was finding out about new stuff at more of a slow rate, and more of what I was getting into was just like passing interests. You know, I didn't discover a lot of like big new favorite bands for a little while. I did get really into Mindless Self-Indulgence at some point. I have their Tighter album, but I like all of them. I still have to this day never managed to buy Frankenstein Girls May Seem Strangely Sexy, even though I love that album, or You'll Rebel to Anything, because I don't see them in stores that often. But I did buy Tighter, which is a remake of their first album. For me with MSI, it was like I got into them slowly because like over the years I would listen to their stuff on YouTube, and it was just like songs here and there that I really liked, and then it was like a long time before I finally downloaded the albums. But my friend Marcus got really into them with me, and if you know about my band Trial of the Golden Witch, because part of the reason I wanted to do this was also to talk about my influences, now that I've actually put out an album that people care about after 6 years of making albums that no one would dare care about. In the early days of my Trial of the Golden Witch band, most of it was just that I would get my friends together, and they would just play acoustic guitars, because my friend Marcus would show up to my house with an acoustic guitar, and he'd just play it at random all the time. And we would just make shit up. Like, every song we did, we just make shit up. Most of it was goofy, bizarre stuff. But, like, sort of the glue holding it all together was that we would do these big, long, like, mashup covers. So, like, Marcus would start playing a riff, and he'd just, like, play a 4-chord progression, like a rhythm guitar progression, like, just 4 chords, just over and over again for like 30 minutes, and the two of us would just improvise, sing the lyrics to like every Mindless Self-Indulgence song over him playing this chord progression. And that was like where a lot of the influence came from. And if you look into my older Trial of the Golden Witch releases, you'll find a bunch of covers of MSI songs. We did one of Clarissa on Best of Year One. We did one of Bullshit on My Friend We Haven't Spoken in a While. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, yeah. A lot of fond memories with MSI because of that. I don't remember when I got really into Silver Sun Pickups. I just know that for years I had been hearing the song Lazy Eye on like the radio and looking it up on YouTube, and I really loved that song. And then at some point, I think I found the other singles, Little Lover So Polite, and I was like, I should buy that album. And then I did, and then it became one of my favorite albums, and it's been orbiting my top 10 for fucking years now. So, really great album there. I also have this Mono album, You Are There. Never been that into Mono. This is actually Boyd's, and I just have it. I think it was because Boyd, for a while, he was buying CDs and anime DVDs. He used to have pretty big collections, but he sold all of it. He sold all his collections, and he just has everything digitally now. So, like a couple of CDs I have, I just poached from him. Like, I knew he was going to sell all his albums, so I took the ones I wanted and just kept them. Not necessarily with permission. That's also why I have this Misfits album, which I think is their first one. It looks like it's self-titled. It might be... Oh, no, this looks like it might be a compilation album. So, yeah, got a Misfits album here that I poached from Boyd. For a while, I started getting into a lot of older music and stuff that, like, my parents listened to back in their day and stuff that I just hadn't really known about. Because, like, I've been digital boy, digibro, 21st century digital boy for like 10 years now. I've always kind of like seen myself as someone who likes things that are current and likes to stay in the present. But there was an era where I finally was willing to like look back and see some of the older bands. Jane's Addiction, I had known about my whole life because my mom was a huge fan of them, but I never really listened to them. And then I listened to Nothing's Shocking, and I fucking love this album. It's one of my favorite albums. It was like a monumental moment to like realize this connection that I could have, with my mom over Jane's Addiction. Really fantastic album. I'm not as into any of their other albums, especially not their modern ones, but pretty good. And then because of that At the Drive-In album I showed earlier, This Station Is Non-Operational, there's a song on there where they covered a song by The Smiths. And I'd never heard of The Smiths, but I was listening to that song in the car with my mom one day, and she was like, "Oh my god, it's The Smiths!" Turns out my mom had been a diehard fan of The Smiths back in the 80s. She had owned all their albums and everything, but she'd lost it all in a fire, because in like 88 or 89, her house burned down, and she lost all her collection of shit. So apparently she had been this huge fan of The Smiths. I'd never heard of them. I started listening to The Smiths, got really into them. I love all their shit. So like, I would listen to that all the time. Steely Dan. In 2011, when I visited my friend Ghost Lightning in the Philippines, as you can see, I have tarnished the Steely Dan box with all these stickers. When I went to visit my friend Ghost Lightning in the Philippines, he introduced me to Steely Dan, which is his favorite band, and he would tell me all this stuff about them, and I downloaded their whole discography, and I would listen to it all the time, and we started, like, walking around in public and singing Steely Dan songs out loud and stuff, and having a fucking grand old time. Just generally, I like most of their stuff. I'm particularly into Can't Buy a Thrill and Aja. Those are the two albums that that stay on my iPod, on my phone rather. I got this collection from one of my mom's friends. She just like gave it to me because she heard I liked Steely Dan and she didn't want it anymore. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, another album I'd heard of my whole life and never really listened to. Got into it, really love it. Still haven't really ever gotten big into any of the other Floyd albums. I do like Animals, but this one's probably still my favorite. Some other bands from around these times that I haven't mentioned. King Crimson, I got really into. That's another one that was part of Boyd's collection. I don't actually own any of their albums. I feel like there's other stuff there's a lot of bands that from that era that I was really into, and I just don't have their music anymore because of the fact that I had this hard drive failure a couple years ago where I lost most of the music I used to have on my computer, and I've never really regained most of it because I had so much. I had a fucking ridiculous amount of music on my computer, and a lot of it was stuff I didn't even listen to. A lot of it was like stuff I was curious about, downloaded the whole discography, didn't like it, and it just sat on my computer forever. So I had lost all this stuff. The only stuff I still had was everything that was on my phone at the time. So like, there's a massive amount of music that I'm sure I would still like, but I haven't really heard it in a few years because I just don't have it anywhere. So then, as we get into the 2010s, I actually had this sort of chain of finding out about bands through live shows, because I've always been someone who goes to a lot of concerts, because I want to see all these bands that I care about so much, and I tend to show up way early. I always want to see the whole thing. I want to get my money's worth out of going to these shows. And so I'd find out about a lot of bands through, like, opening acts. And if I knew what the opening acts were going to be before I saw the show, then I would check them out before the time of the show. So, one time, Coheed and Cambria was finally coming around here. At this point, they just put out their 5th album, which I didn't like as much, and honestly, their live show was not that great. They're very inconsistent in their live shows, but I was looking into the bands that were opening for them, because it was Coheed and Cambria with Circa Survive, and I got into their album Blue Sky Noise, which is a pretty good album. Don't really like any of their other stuff, but Circa Survive is the same singer as The Sound of Animals Fighting, so I kind of knew about them already. But a band I'd never even heard of that was opening for this show was The Deer Hunter. And I looked into them, and I found a bunch of songs I liked, and I had put together like this mix CD of my favorite songs by them, would listen to it all the time, saw them live, it was great, and then, not too long after that, I got really into them, bought all 3 of their ACT albums, and Acts 2 and 3 are particularly great. Act 2 is probably one of my favorite albums, but they're all 3 ACT albums are really solid. They later would put out, like not too long after I got into them, they started up this Color EP, Color Spectrum EP collection, where they made 8 EPs that were 4 songs each, that each had represented one color of the spectrum, including white and black. So maybe it was 9 EPs. But anyways, the Color Spectrum EPs were coming out, and they started touring for that. But they were with, I mean, they're pretty small band. Obviously, they were an opening act for Coheed and Circa. So they were also an opening act for a band called Manchester Orchestra, who I'd never heard of. So I start looking into them. I found myself liking some of their songs, really liked their live show, and then not long after that show, Manchester Orchestra pretty much became one of my favorite bands. And the worst thing about this chain is that I always end up getting really into the band after seeing them live. So like, it's like when I actually saw them, I wouldn't have appreciated it as much as I would now. And in this chain, each band released an album I didn't like as much before their next tour. So like Coheed had just released You're the Black Rainbow, which I wasn't that into. And then the Color Spectrum EPs I wasn't as into as the 3-act albums. And they only played like probably 8 songs because they were an opening act. So it was a lot of Color Spectrum stuff. And then Manchester Orchestra, their 4th album, I didn't like at all. So if they were to tour again, then I would just be reliving the drama all over again. But the 2nd and 3rd albums by them are both in my top 10. Mean Everything to Nothing and Simple Math are both in my top 10. And through this progression, like, the Deer Hunter is pretty similar to Coheed and Cambria in that they write these like big sort of epic narrative albums, these 80-minute concept albums telling a story with like lots of different instrumentation. They're a little bit more experimental than Coheed, and they involve a lot of this like vaudeville sound, like this like Baroque and vaudeville kind of things, and they're really cool. I like them a lot. They have a lot of heart. Manchester Orchestra is a lot more straightforward. It's more of just like an indie rock band, but one with like a very powerful sound. They tend to kick things up a notch and go into like their sound's not really heavy, but it's got a lot of like muscle to it, and I really like that about them. And just this album and the next one are favorites of mine. You'll see them again when I get out my LPs. But yeah, I was really way into this, and I still am. Still one of my favorites. A band that I found out about just because I was hearing about how influential they are on the internet, Slint with the album Spiderland. This is a really creepy, disturbing, like grunge rock / post-rock proggy kind of thing from the early 90s, a little bit beyond classification. Nothing else really sounds like this album. But I got into these guys because I was reading the book House of Leaves, pictured right here, which is my favorite book of all time and one of my favorite things of all time. And it's a really like sort of unsettling horror themed book. And I listened to this album like over and over again the whole time I was reading it. It was really cool. And then around this time is also when I discovered what for years was my favorite band, which is Shinsei Kamate-chan. This is a band who I first discovered because they performed the opening theme for the anime series Denpa Onna to Seishun Otoko, which is a show I didn't even watch. I didn't even finish the first episode of it because I didn't like it. But the opening theme was utterly captivating and beautiful and perfect. It was a show from Studio Shaft, and I believe Akiyuki Shinbo was credited on it. This was like before people realized that Shinbo was not really directing most of the Shaft shows, that he was chief director for a lot of them, which basically means he oversees the studio, but wasn't necessarily like directly having his hand in directing a lot of these shows. And I think this was one of those cases. But like in any case, I discovered the band through that, and I immediately was like searching for more of their music, and everything I found was these crazy, insane demos. Because the thing about Shinsei Kamate-chan is that they were signed to a major label, miraculously somehow, but they would release all of their songs online as the demo versions. Like the lead singer and songwriter Noko would just like he had like a YouTube channel, and he'd just post all the songs. So like you can find all the songs from their first 3 albums online pretty easily, or at least like the vast majority of them, but they're all in like these crazy intense demos that are like unmastered and unfiltered and bizarre. And I mean, even the albums themselves are pretty fucking out there. Their sound was just over the top insanity. And like the thing about Shinsekai Mate-chan is that they're basically just like a pop rock band. Like their songs are very Beatles influenced. Like the structures of them are very simple. It's usually like a four chord progression of a guitar, but it's everything they put on top of it that makes it insane. Where they have a keyboardist who's always playing these like ridiculous arpeggios and just like super loud, insane sounds. The vocalist will put these like multi-track vocals over everything that are going like over like the whole song. He's screaming into these voice morphers. Half the songs, when I first discovered them, I was like, oh, they have two vocalists, a man and a woman. But it's not. It's just the lead singer screaming into a voice changer that makes him sound like a woman. Their first 4 albums are all among my favorite albums of all time, especially their second one, Suman Ne. Don't like their last 2 at all, and they have like a new like mini album. Don't like that one either. Their sound has kind of gotten more, not necessarily radio friendly. It's still like out there and experimental, but it's more cleaned up and less like unhinged and crazy. But the reason I was so into it is that I discovered them at a time when I was like a NEET, when I was like doing nothing with my life and I was at home all the time and I was paranoid and I was losing my mind, and that is exactly what these songs are about. This is all music about like, you know, just every kind of mental confusion you could have is represented in these albums. That's why I loved them so much. And I don't really feel that way anymore, so it's a lot harder to relate to. So alright, now we're finally about to branch into the next really big evolution in my musical taste, which is the Fantano era. This is where I discovered the internet's busiest music nerd, Anthony Fantano, and I'll get into how this happened exactly. So it's like really early into 2013. I've got a YouTube career getting off the ground. I'm kind of spending, less and less time with music in a way. Although I was really into like Brony music for a while because I was a big part of the Brony community and there was all kinds of crazy music coming out of it. I was a huge fan of this artist called So Great and Powerful, who never had any physical releases, so I don't have any of those around, but I was really into him. Made friends with a wonderful artist named Jeff Burgess, who made the album Autumn Nights, which is a dope-ass concept album that is just really interesting and cool, as well as Horse Friend. He gave me both of these albums in person, and they are great. But it's early 2013. I'm listening to all this like Brony music and weird shit and Shinsekai Mate-chan, and I made a new friend, this guy named Trevor, who a lot of you might know if you follow my gaming channel and stuff. He's been in some of the episodes of that. And he's a big-time music fan. Now, I already was friends with Brandon Tolentino, who you also might know from my gaming channel, who is also a big music guy. But Brandon has never been one to, like, share a lot of his music necessarily, and I also don't like much of the music he listens to. And this is also true of Trevor. Both of them have, like, much more, they're much more into, like, hipstery, jangle, pop, rock kind of shit. And, like, well, okay, it's not fair to, like, pigeonhole Trevor's taste because he likes everything, but like both of them just tend towards music that I don't tend to like. But every once in a while, Trevor gets me into a band that I absolutely adore. And Trevor had posted on his Facebook page the song Bitch Don't Kill My Vibe by Kendrick Lamar. Now remember, up until this point, I've mostly been big into like indie prog and metal and all this like experimental shit. I've just been into like this whole out there category of music, and I haven't really been exploring other genres in a big way. And so even though I did grow up listening to like some hip hop and I did have some experience with it, and I always thought like if I tried to get into the genre I could, but I didn't really know where to start. Bitch Don't Kill My Vibe was more or less my beginning of getting into rap music in a big way, because it was just such a like trippy and interesting and cool and chilled out song that I was immediately drawn to it. And like I heard it, I listened to it, I was like, that was really cool. And then I listened to it again, and then I listened to it all day, and then like, I start looking into who Kendrick Lamar is and finding more of his songs, and then I found like Backseat Freestyle, which is this like ignorant ass song, and I was like, this is nothing like what I expected. But then I find out that this is a concept album and that song's part of the story because it was supposed to be a song that he would have written when he was 17, and I just get way into it, and I end up listening to this whole album and falling in love with it. So like a couple of people had suggested to me Anthony Fantano, the internet's busiest music nerd of the Needle Drop channel. I'd like glanced at a video or two, didn't really, pay much mind to it. But then I found his review of Good Kid, Mad City, which was like this really, it was like his #2 album of the year, and he gave it all this high praise, and everything he said about it was exactly what I felt about it. So I was like, this guy's cool, I'm gonna follow his shit. So I start following Fantano. Now, bear in mind, up until this point, as I've, probably made clear, I've been someone who will go out of my way to like research music and to get into new stuff. So when I find a guy who like every single day is recommending some album that I've never heard of and is into like every kind of music, then it was just the rabbit hole from then on. This is also a period where, because I started making like money, like my own money, and like having money to spend on stuff, like when I first started making money, I was really determined that I was going to spend all of it on art. Like none of it was for me, all of it was for me to pay for all the things that I loved so I could support all these artists and help them out. And so I started buying music a lot, and I figured that if I really want to show my support for an artist, the best way to do that would be to buy the most expensive version of their thing, and then I also get the gratification of having the most expensive version of their thing. So I started collecting vinyls because they look fucking awesome. It's a huge, epic version of the artwork that's heavy in your hand and feels cool to own, and also it's a great way to support the artist because I give them even more money than I would have otherwise, assumably. So before I completely go down the rabbit hole of the whole Anthony Fantano era, I want to talk about some of my other favorite albums from the previous eras that I just never owned on CD, but I do now own on vinyl. So another one of my favorite Japanese bands, who I always had a sort of passing interest in over the years, because this is another band that Boyd was big into. He had their albums, I had downloaded their albums onto my computer, and I'd listen to them occasionally, was the band Boris. Boris are known for the fact that they are just totally out there and experimental, and all their albums are something completely different. They had a lot of drone albums, they had some punk rock albums, they had some just like grimy, weird shit, experimental shit. The first ones I had listened to were Heavy Rocks, which is more of like a punk intense album, and Pink, which combines that punk intensity with some more like ethereal droney songs. And then I found out about Flood, which is still one of my favorite albums, which is just this hour-long, like super relaxing post-rock epic. Saw them perform that live, and that's probably my favorite live show I've ever been to. But the thing about Boris is that most of their stuff is hard to come by in the U.S. Their albums are not like just everywhere. They're not easily bought, and they go out of print a lot. So the only one I actually own is a crossover album they did called BXI, which is an album they did with this guy called Ian Astbury as a vocalist, and it's really weird. It's kind of just like an alternative rock EP. It's just like 4 alt-rock songs that are like fairly straightforward and sound like they could almost be on the radio, if not for the fact that Boris is just a little too weird. And Ian Astbury is like almost like Steve Conti sounding, like in his vocal performance. It's very odd. But yeah, it's a pretty cool little EP, and I found it, and I figured like probably no one owns this, so I want to be the guy who owns this. I did repurchase In Keeping Secrets of Silent Earth 3 by Coheed and Cambria on vinyl because they re-released it pretty recently. See, a lot of these bands that I was into back in the day, in the throughout the 2000s, before the 2010s, vinyl was not being made because everyone just saw it as like a dated thing. Why would you want it? I mean, usually when stuff came out on vinyl, it was like special edition limited copies. Like, for instance, Francis the Mute by the Mars Volta. There was a vinyl version that had the actual song called Francis the Mute on it, because that song didn't make it onto the album. But like, I didn't have anything to play it on, so I never bought it, even though I did find it one time. And like, bands might have, like Agalach had some EPs that were vinyl only with like only 500 pressings and stuff like that, which are pretty great. But yeah, like there wasn't a lot of like albums just coming out on both vinyl and CD. It was usually just a CD because nobody bought vinyl. And then vinyl kind of came back into fashion in the last like 5 5 or 6 years. So suddenly now everyone puts out a vinyl version. So like with the first 4 Coheed albums, vinyl was not in. They just didn't sell them. But then they re-released IKSOSC3. So I bought that just because I love the album and I love the artwork and I wanted to own it. I wanted to own a Coheed vinyl. And Plastic Beach, the third Gorillaz album, which came out in 2010. Pretty great album. Was probably my least favorite of their 3. However, and I mean, I've never really listened to their 4th one because just for whatever reason, I never found the time to like give it a shot. But when Plastic Beach came out, I didn't like it as much, but because I've heard the first 2 so many times that they sound like white noise to me now, this one is a lot easier to return to and still, like, feel something. Moving into a little bit more recent era, another artist who I got into because Trevor just happened to post one of their songs on Facebook was Sufjan Stevens. He had posted the song Impossible Soul, which is a 25-minute track that closes out this already 80-minute album, or it's 80 minutes after that one, I think. This is a massive album, and I just absolutely loved the level of like experimentation and weirdness and the density of all the different sounds on this thing. I like Sufjan's other stuff. I like Illinois. I don't as much enjoy like his more simple folk stuff. I like his more weird out there experimental stuff. But this is the only album that I've like consistently loved from start to finish and like consider a favorite. So that's why I bought that one. Manchester Orchestra on their website had like each of their albums on vinyl for like $16 a piece or something, and they had a 3-pack, so I bought all 3 of them. Simple Math, their 3rd album, one of my top 10 favorite albums. Mean Everything to Nothing, I already had it on CD, bought it again on vinyl because it's one of my top 10 favorite albums. And their first album, I'm Like a Virgin Losing a Child, which is not as good as their second or third. It very much feels like a newbie effort from like some very young band members, but it's still pretty cool. It's got some interesting tracks on it. You can tell it's very influenced by like Neutral Milk Hotel and shit like that. Carnivus by Silver Sun Pickups. I bought it again on vinyl because it's just so fucking beautiful. It's probably my favorite album cover, so I just wanted to have it in big size. And then some bands I haven't actually talked about yet that I got into at some point in like the early 2010s. Flogging Molly with Drunken Lullabies. I don't really like any of their other albums, but this one's consistently great from start to finish. Really fun mixture of punk rock and Irish folk music. It's really fucking cool. And Andrew W.K., the master of party, the craziest, partiest motherfucker in the entire world. This guy just wants to party. He doesn't want to do anything else. This is just like a bunch of really fun, upbeat rock songs that are all about partying. That's all it is. It's the most like life-affirming, yeah, album of all time. And while I'm bringing this up, I should also mention the band Maximum the Hormone, who similarly is a Japanese nu metal band that all their songs are just like fun rock anthem type stuff. I don't own any of their albums because they're hard to come by in the US, but Bui Iki Kaesu, which is their 3rd album, I think, this is one of my favorites of all time as well. So alright, let's get into the Fantano era. As I've mentioned already, getting into Fantano was mostly through Kendrick Lamar, through Good Kid, Mad City. This album came much later, but I got into rap music in a pretty big way as a result of that. In 2013, there was this spattering of really great rap albums that I kind of got into all at once. One was Acid Rap by Chance the Rapper. Unfortunately, it's never had a physical release, but it's one of my favorite albums of all time. I got huge into Good Kid, Mad City and Acid Rap at around the same time. There were some albums that I wasn't as into, but that some of my friends got big into because a lot of my friends also got really big into hip-hop at the same time. A$AP Ferg's Trap Lord was one that a lot of my friends were bumping all the time, and I really do love that album for at least half of its songs. Denzel Curry came out with Nostalgic 64, which about half of the album's really good. The other half, I don't give a fuck about. But there were a couple of bands that really sort of changed everything for me. The first one was Clipping. Their first album, Mid City. Clipping is a band that combines harsh noise with rap. Now, there is actually an artist who I liked before this, who was probably the only rap artist that I've been listening to for all this time, and I don't own any of their albums, which is why I neglected to mention them. But they're called Dialect, which is spelled like Dalek. But the band Dialect are known for the fact that they combined like industrial sounds and like some harsh noise segments and like post-rock kind of sounds with hip-hop. And I really love their album Abandoned Language. It's one of my favorites, and I've been listening to it over the years, but to me it never, like, because it sounded so different from any other hip-hop music, it never like made me feel like, oh, this is now going to get me into rap. You know, I actually felt like I was more into the instrumentals than I was into what was going on like vocally or lyrically. And for a long time, like, Dialect never really became as influential as they should have been, like, in spite of, you know, really, God, the camera looks like I'm slowing down. In spite of, like, how much originality they had and, like, you know, how much impact their music should have had, I don't think they ever took off in a big way. I mean, they would tour with, like, rock bands. They toured with ISIS. They toured with, like, you know, with Mogwai instead of touring with hip-hop artists because they were just so out there that people didn't know what to do with them. Clipping, and another band we'll talk about in a second, kind of brought this sound to the forefront. Clipping, you know, it was straight up just harsh noise and rap, and it was crazy and intense. And at first, I wasn't sure what to make of it. But what actually got me into Clipping was I listened to their whole album. I wasn't really paying attention, and then the last song came on, which is called Outro, and it's just 10 straight minutes of the vocalist going, get money, get money, get money, get money, get money, get money. And it's 2 tracks of his voice that slowly desynchronize over the course of the song and then resynchronize at the end. And I thought it was the funniest shit ever, and I loved it. I was like, this is the coolest thing I've ever heard. I have to get into this album now. And then I gave it, you know, more of a chance and realized just how fun and cool it was. So me and my friend Brando were getting really into Clipping, and you know, I have their second album here. Their first album never came out physically. I think there might have been a tape or something, but I'm not sure. But I got their second album, which was on a major label, which is Clipping, which is really good, and their brand new album, Splendor and Misery. I've only had the chance to listen to this a couple of times, but it's pretty cool. It is a hip-hop sci-fi concept album. Very odd, very different sound from anything I've ever heard before, including from them. But, if Clipping was like the setup, then the punchline was a whole other beast. I am, of course, referring to Death Grips. Death Grips, The Money Store. This was an album that Anthony Fantano had given a 10 out of 10. It was his album of the year, above Good Kid, Mad City. The first time I tried to listen to this, I immediately was like, what the fuck am I listening to? Didn't understand it at all and stopped. A little bit later, I got into them because I heard the song The Fever, which is track 2 on here, which is like one of the more catchy and fun songs, and I got really into The Fever, and then I started showing it to all my friends, and all of them got really into the song. And then around the same time that I got into Clipping, me and my friend Brando got into The Money Store. Now, over my whole life, I've wanted to make music. I've always wanted to be a musician. I've mostly wanted to be a vocalist. I've always loved singing. I do it all the time when I'm hanging around. You know, I sing my heart out. However, I'm not an amazing singer. People don't often praise my singing. I never felt like I was going to have a future in it, and more importantly, I don't know anyone who can really write or perform music. Even though I have a bunch of songs like I've written in my head, I hate trying to learn instruments. I just thought, you know, I've always been into rock music. It just seemed out of my reach to try to make rock music. But it's not that I wasn't experienced in rap music, because, you know, as a kid, I would rap along to Eminem and Wu-Tang and all that shit that I was hearing, you know, when I did hear it. And even bands like Linkin Park, who have a heavy rap element to their music, you know. So I was kind of used to the idea of rapping. Now, when I discovered Clipping and Death Grips, it opened up the doors for, like, what you could rap over. That you could rap over these like insane, noisy, grungy, broken instrumentals. And I had seen this article with like the members of Clipping were describing how they put together the song about that. And it was like they just taken all these there was like a sample in there that's like they took a cassette case and open and shut it, and like that's part of the beat, you know. They would just take all these different like things around their desk or like weird things they could make noises out of and run them through this like really high-tech machinery and create all these crazy ass sounds. And I immediately wanted to do that. So my friend Brando had written all these lyrics that were just like these really violent, crass, stupid, dumb lyrics that I absolutely loved. And I just decided I was going to make my own beats like Clipping does, but I was making them all in Audacity, mostly with my mouth. And this is how the EP called BC came together. Now, I had already made an EP called AC, which was just like experimental noises. That one had no rapping on it. It was just like me making weird fucking sounds in my room and recording it and trying to turn it into music. You know, because I'd always been into like trying to make experimental stuff. But this is the first time I thought, whoa, I can make weird experimental hip hop. So I put together these beats that would be like the sound of a window closing and like a lawnmower outside and a can being crumpled up. And I'd make that into a beat. And then I took these lyrics that Brando had because he, you know, wasn't really experienced with rapping and wasn't that into like trying to actually perform it. And I would do his raps over these beats. And I really loved the result. And so from that point forward, I was like, rapping is now taking over as opposed to singing, you know, because I think I just like, it just made a lot more sense to me because I could both make my own beats, which would be these crazy out there beats, and then I could also like, you know, perform these a lot more easily than I could sing songs. It just seemed to fit my persona better to write grungy, insane raps. So Death Grips very quickly became my favorite band ever. Their first album, Ex-Military, unfortunately I don't own any physical copies of, but it's probably my favorite of their albums. I just would listen to it all the fucking time. The Money Store I already showed. Bottomless Pit, which is their new one that came out this year. The Powers That Be, the two-parter, which came out across 2013 and 2014. No, 2014 and 2015. Yeah, 2014 and 2015. Both parts are fucking great. I've got No Love Deep Web. If I opened this, you would see a picture of the drummer's dick, because his dick pic is the album cover. I have a whole video about Death Grips on this channel called Is Death Grips the Best Band of the Decade? If you want to hear me talk about them more. But Death Grips was such a huge, important influence on me and really inspired me to like start, you know, looking for how can I make music out of weird things? How can I make videos that are bizarre and just unhinged and out there? And, you know, I got really into that kind of shit. I think BC was actually recorded before I got really into Death Grips. It was mostly inspired by Clipping, but then like going forward, everything I've done has had a heavy Death Grips influence. The CC mixtape is much more Death Grips influenced than BC was, in spite of being a little bit less harsh. But yeah, so that's the first really huge influence. And like all those rap albums that I've talked about, like all of them are pretty big influences on me. Chance the Rapper and Kendrick Lamar in particular. But like Death Grips is everything, and they're definitely still my favorite band to this day. So anyways, around this time, I'm just getting into like all kinds of crazy shit. Everything Fantano talks about, I have to give a shot. I remember this was, I think, the first LP I even bought, because it was the first great album that came out in 2014. The first album that I was like super into, and I think it was 2014. Was it 2013 or 2014? I want to say 2014. You know, I've been following Fantano for a little bit, got into this album, really loved it, bought it immediately, which is the Silver Mount Zion with their album, what's this one called? Fuck Off, Get Free, We Pour Light on Everything. That's the name of the album. So, yeah, pretty cool post-rock album with a sort of... It's like post-rock, but with more of a emphasis on the rock and a little bit of like grungy, weird instrumentation. It's very cool. It's probably still my favorite like post-rock album. From last year, Hop Along with their album Painted Shut. This is just fun indie rock music that I really like. Pom Pom by Ariel Pink. This came out towards the end of 2014, was one of my favorite albums of that year. This is a really out there experimental pop album that all sounds like it was recorded in the 70s in a toilet. And it's great. It's just a really long album and every song's totally different. My favorite album of last year, Clarence Clarity with No Now, an insane experimental R&B album that is just, I always describe it as, it sounds like you're living inside of a computer, and like it's all of the pop music and pop culture in the computer swirling into one thing, and that computer also has a virus and it's falling apart in front of your eyes. That's what this album sounds like. One of my all-time favorite albums, this is in my top 5 for sure right now, and it was my favorite album of 2014, which is Rat King with So It Goes. This is a hip-hop outfit of some very young men who put together this sort of grungy experimental hip-hop record that is just fucking perfect. I love every song on this thing. It just has a great sound. It's an album that is sort of about New York, and it's about capturing the sound of living in New York. And the sound of New York is, of course, a very dense and interesting sort of sound. I love the urban aesthetic. I love the aesthetic of like a dark city and like exploring the back alleys of a city. And I mean, when I say urban aesthetic, I mean not as in like the way people dress in the city, but I mean the city itself, the aesthetic of being in a densely populated urban area. And this captures that aesthetic very, very well. It feels like the city itself put to music with these young guys rapping over it. And it's just fucking cool. And that's a huge influence on my style as well. Like, I take a lot of influence from Wiki. I would say Wiki, Chance, Kendrick, fucking MC Ride from Death Grips, Daveed Diggs from Clipping, and Danny Brown, who's a more recent influence. Those are probably like the biggest influences on my rapping style. And of course, Eminem. I mean, Eminem permeates all of it because I've been listening to him since I was a kid. So there's a huge Eminem influence on everything that I rap about. Tony Molina's Dissed and Dismissed. This is a fucking 12 songs in 11 minutes. This is the shortest album ever, but it's all these really fun, cool breakup songs that sound kind of like if Weezer and the Pillows fused together. And this was the soundtrack to my breakup. When I broke up with my girlfriend like a few years ago, this album had like just came out, and it's all songs about breakups. So I was just spinning it constantly and losing my shit. It was fucking perfect. P-Lander Z, this is not a Fantano recommendation album, but this is just a band that performed at Otakon at one of their live Matsuri events that's like outside the convention, and it was just such an awesome show that I bought their album. They're like this like sort of cheesy, fun punk rock band that dresses like Power Rangers and and puts on shows that are really energetic and cool. So I loved their performance so much I had to buy their album. Obsidian by Baths. This is an electronic producer who does these sort of low-key, atmospheric sounding electronic songs that he sings over about just sort of depressing subject matters. Melt Banana's Fetch. This is a blisteringly fucking intense hard rock album. I guess they'd be considered like almost grindcore or just like acid rock or something. It just sounds like... My mom heard this in the car once, and she thought that it was a 33 being played at 45, if you know what that means. Which is like, there's two different kinds of records. Those that rotate at 33 times per minute, and those that rotate at 45. If you play a 33 at 45, it sounds like it's chipmunked, essentially. And my mom thought that's what was going on in this album, because it's just so fast and crazy and intense. Really love it. Touche Amore with Is Survived By. This is a post-hardcore album that's very emotional, screamed vocals, but glistening guitars, sort of like a, not quite like At the Drive-In, but more like, I don't know. If you know what post-hardcore is, then you know what to expect. Father John Misty's album from last year, I Love You Honey Bear, which is a just folk album, I guess, like a folk pop, folk rock kind of thing. Each song sounds very different. They're all about love. It's all about this guy, Father John Misty, getting married and singing about his life at the time. Really pretty and cool. The Uncluded with Hokey Fright. This is the rapper Aesop Rock and the indie folk artist Kimya Dawson. Very odd combination that works super well. One of my favorite albums. It's like fucking almost, 16 songs? And they're all, there's a lot of variety, and every song has its own unique, very charming personality that I love. This is another Touche Amore album, To the Beat of a Dead Horse. It's their second album. I picked this up just because I was so surprised that I saw it in a record store that I had to buy it. I've only listened to it a couple times, so I don't really have much of an opinion on it. And lastly, what may very well be my favorite album of all time, Endless Fantasy by Anamanaguchi. This is a chiptune rock album. Almost, it sounds like power metal. It's just like a bunch of really fast, fun, upbeat, energetic songs that make you feel like you are the fucking prince of the cosmos. It's super video gamey. It's super, cheesy and fun and upbeat and lovable, and it's adorable, and I love it. It's fucking long. It's like 90 fucking minutes long. It's got 22 tracks on it. It's hard to get into because this album's so fucking long and so much of it sounds so similar that like the first couple times you hear it, you'll probably be like, I can't parse any meaning out of this. Though the songs Japan Air and Prom Night, which are the only two songs that have vocals on them and are probably my two favorite songs on the album, are a lot more accessible. But in any case, this album never gets old. Like, it's so long and so energetic and so fun that, like, I can always put it on and it'll always be great. And it's the ultimate long drive album. If you need to survive a long drive, this album will be your companion for at least 80 fucking minutes of it. It might be closer to 90 minutes. I don't remember if it's over 80 minutes or not. So that's all the stuff that I actually own. Here's a lithograph that's signed by the members of Clipping that I won in a store the other day. That's pretty fucking cool. There's lots of other albums that I really like that I just don't own physical copies of. Kanye West with his album, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. I made a whole video about how much I like that album. Oh, I totally skipped over some more of these CDs from the same era. Congratulations by MGMT. I got into this right around the time I discovered Fantano. This is one of my favorite albums as well. It's just like a psych rock, experimental, fun time. Every song on it is golden. I like their other albums too, but not as much as this one. This one's fucking fantastic. Lady Gaga's Art Pop. This is one that, like, I was totally shocked by, because, like, Lady Gaga's music before this is not bad. I love her, like, catchy hooks and stuff, but it's all just pretty simple dance music. On this album, she gets way more out there, way more variety in the songs, lots of experimentation, all while keeping that pop. This album, basically, the thesis statement is boogie pop. It should have just been called boogie pop as opposed to art pop, because art pop sounds pretentious and lame. Boogie pop would have been a really cool name for it. But anyways, it's a fucking great album. I absolutely love it. I bought the Rolling Girls OP on its like little single at Otakon last year. And then there's these albums that my fans have sent me since opening my P.O. box. This Sayonara Zetsubo Sensei OST, this K-On! OST, and a fan's own album, Gold Season. I also have this album, Paper House, I think, by Kenneth Crayley and his band, somewhere over there. What else do I like? What do I listen to? I listen to pretty much everything. I mean, around the time I got into Fantano, and I'm surprised by how many of my LPs are directly Fantano recommended, because, like, there's lots of stuff I've gotten into that's not because of him that apparently I just haven't bought yet. Really love The Unnatural World by Have a Nice Life, and their first album, Death Consciousness. I'm just, like, thinking of stuff that I've, like, bought digitally that I don't have a physical copy of. Bus Driver, his albums Perfect Hair and Thumbs are among my favorite rap albums of the last few years. Milo, who collaborates with Busdriver a lot, was a huge influence as well. His albums, Things That Happen at Day and Things That Happen at Night, and then his album Cavalcade were all like really huge in getting me into rap music and shaping my development there. So I should have probably mentioned them before. Again, it's harder if I don't have a physical copy in front of me to look at. And a lot of bands I get really into for a little while, and then I don't listen to as much later on. So like, it's hard to like think of which ones am I the most into. The new Danny Brown album is probably my favorite album of this year, other than like Bottomless Pit and David Bowie's Black Star, which is also fantastic. Would love to pick up a copy of that at some point. But the other way I got into a lot of music around this era was through the 4chan board Mew, the /mu/board, which is the music board. I would just like, they have on Mew, they have just like all these recommendation charts where it'll be like, here's a genre and here's how you can get into them. It'll like show a flow chart of like which albums you should listen to in which order to try to get into a genre. I've gone through a bunch of those, or there'll be charts that are just like essential albums from this genre. I'll go through those. I have a ton of them saved on my computer. If you just go onto like Google and type like 4chan Moo Essentials, there's like a whole website of just the Essentials charts out there. So I listen to tons of those. More often than not, I don't necessarily get like really into any of those albums. I just end up like, listening to them in passing more. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of bands and albums I could talk about here that I've gotten into, and like most genres now at this point I have some experience with. I've never gotten like hugely into jazz. I have listened to like, Bitches Brew and like the Kamasi Washington's The Epic. I've heard a lot of jazz influenced stuff, but I've never gotten like big into that genre. Never gotten into country in any way. I've tried a bunch of times. People have sent me a bunch of country music. I still have not found any country I really liked, unless you like count Mark Lanigan, because he's pretty country influenced, or maybe Father John Misty to some extent, but like they're barely country. And I've listened to like every album that anyone considers a classic. I've heard all the Radioheads. I like Kid A. Just not like a huge Radiohead fan or anything. I've heard In the Aeroplane Over the Sea. Really love the first 3 tracks. Don't care for the rest of the album. What other questions could I possibly answer about my musical taste, history, and influences? I guess you've probably mostly got the gist of it. And it's kind of funny to like only talk about my rap influences, because again, like for such a long time, I thought I was going to be like a normal, like singing vocalist. So like as a singer, I was hugely influenced by and lyricist. I was mostly influenced by like the Mars Volta, Coheed, and Portugal the Man, which are all like those high register singers who I would copy a lot, and they all had like deep esoteric lyrics. But yeah, as a rapper, like none of those really apply all that much. It's mostly the rappers that I've named that are the big influences. And these days, I have a much harder time listening to most of the stuff I've talked about in the early part. Not because I don't like it, but because, like, as I said, how I got into so many of those was that I was in high school, and an 80-minute, epic prog album was a good way to fucking occupy my time when I was just sitting around being depressed all day. But that's not my lifestyle anymore. Now I am, always working, and I don't have as much time for music. And when a new album comes out that's fucking 80 minutes long, it can be like, oh God, am I ever going to have time for this? Like the new Deer Hunter albums, like they had Act 4 last year, which I did like, enough. But then Act 5 came out this year, and like I was listening to it, and like every song is like 6 minutes long, and there's like 15 of them, and I was like, this is gonna be my whole, like this is all day. This takes forever. Whereas like the new Danny Brown album's like 15 tracks and they're all 2 minutes long, and I was like, oh yeah, 2 minutes. I mean, if you listen to Bedroom Bedrock, my rap album, like like from the beginning I said it's gonna be 10 tracks, and I didn't care how long those tracks were. Most of them are like 2 minutes long, because I really like the idea of just like, get the idea and it's over and let's move on. I still do love songs that have like these big momentous tempo changes over the course of them, but like it's so much rarer for me to listen to an 80-minute album as opposed to a 40-minute album, with the exception of Endless Fantasy, and only because even that I don't listen to like the whole thing unless I'm editing video or something. It's mostly in my car. like most of the albums I still, you know, will put on over and over again would be stuff like you know, the Manchester Orchestra albums, where it's like a 40-minute tight punch and it's over and I can move on with my life. And I've also gotten a lot more into just listening to songs. Like, for the longest time, I was always an album guy. I've always been mostly an album guy, and I still am mostly an album guy. But I can more tolerably just put on a song and, you know, put on shuffle in my car and listen to whatever comes on, as opposed to always listening to an album as I usually used to do. Uh, and I also listen to lots of stuff that I wouldn't even necessarily consider like a favorite, but I listen to it all the time. Sweet Trip is a band who, like, their albums Halika and Velocity Design Comfort, like, neither one is necessarily one of my favorite albums, but because it's very easy to listen to, like when I'm editing and stuff, then I'll just put that on all the time. Or like Dean Blunt's Black Metal, like if I just feel tired and sleepy, I'll just loop that album all fucking night, because it's a very good, like, weird little experimental quiet album that's good for sleepy times. Some more albums I really love that didn't make this because of not owning physical. Black Black, I talked about them in a video before. Really love their albums, but I don't think there even exist physical copies. Whatever, I could go on like this all day. I'll try to find links to like some of my charts of my top 100. I need to redo my top 100 favorite albums chart, so I might just wait till I redo it and then add that to the description. Yeah, I could go on all day, and I'm probably going to make more videos about music, more vlogs about music. I've been having fun with the ones I have done, and I have plans for more, so this was just a way to get all of the shit out there for anyone who's curious and who really wants that sort of, you know, whatever. This video is too fucking long. Have a nice day.